If you're already retired, and you believe that after paying off your home, you can finally live in peace in the house that's truly yours, then listen carefully to this. In the United States today, many people are not losing their homes because they're poor. They're losing them for a far more frightening reason. The system does not allow them to grow old in the homes they paid for with a lifetime of work. Property tax used to be just another bill to manage. But for people living on fixed income, it has become the line between being able to stay and being forced to leave. There are people who have never missed a single payment, who have never taken on another dollar of debt. Yet every year, they still open that letter with the fear of someone waiting for a verdict. And then, something rare happened. Some states were forced to change how they treat retirees, not because they wanted to, but because if they didn't, they would lose an entire generation that built those communities. 5. Florida, a retirement paradise, or a trap that forces seniors out of their homes. Florida was once seen as the finish line for Americans. No state income tax, warm weather, a slower pace of life. For decades, millions chose Florida with one simple belief: I've worked my whole life. In retirement, at least I'll be secure in my own home. But in recent years, that belief has begun to crack. Not because retirees are spending recklessly, not because they've taken on new debt, but because Florida's housing cost structure has pushed beyond what fixed income can withstand. The danger isn't a single bill. It's the feeling that with each passing year, control over one's own home slips a little further away. Retirees are no longer afraid of this year's number. They're afraid of what next year will bring. After the pandemic, Florida saw a massive wave of in-migration. Home assessments surged, even for houses that hadn't been renovated or expanded. At the same time, homeowners' insurance costs exploded due to hurricanes, flooding, and increasingly frequent climate risks. For people still working, this is pressure. For retirees, it's a breaking point. Many paid off their homes long ago, no mortgage, no interest, yet still feel as if they're renting back their own house from the system. At this point, the issue is no longer hidden at the highest levels of the state. In public statements on budgets and housing, Florida's governor has repeatedly made one position very clear. Someone who has fully paid off their home should not be forced to leave simply because they've lived long enough. That isn't a campaign slogan. It's an acknowledgement that Florida is facing the risk of pushing retirees out of the very communities they helped build. Florida understands this very clearly. If retirees leave, the state doesn't just lose residents. It loses the most stable spending population, the group least dependent on the labor market and the backbone of the local service economy. This is no longer a humanitarian story. It's a survival equation. However, Florida also cannot simply erase all housing-related obligations, because property taxes still fund schools, police, fire departments, and infrastructure. So instead of tearing down the system, the state intervenes at the point that causes the most harm: the primary residence and the way costs escalate over time. And I want to be very clear about one critical thing here. $0 is not automatic. It only exists if you belong to the right qualifying group and file correctly. Miss one step or assume the system will protect you automatically, and you'll still pay like everyone else. This is exactly why so many people believe Florida says one thing and does another. Not because the policy doesn't exist, but because they enter it the wrong way. The most dangerous thing in Florida isn't the policy itself, it's misunderstanding the policy. Many people run into trouble simply because they fail to update paperwork on time or assume everything will apply by default. Florida does not forgive complacency. When you get it wrong, the consequence doesn't arrive all at once, but it comes steadily, coldly, and is very hard to undo. Florida today is no longer the unconditional retirement paradise promised by old postcards. But one important line has been redrawn. The home is no longer used as a tool to punish people simply for living long enough. And in today's America, that difference alone is a very big one. If what's happening feels familiar to your own situation, hit like so the algorithm understands that this topic needs to be talked about more. And subscribe to the channel, because what you don't yet know about housing and taxes for retirees is often what people end up paying for the latest. 4. Texas, where many believe they're safe until the bill arrives. Texas is the state retirees misunderstand the most in America, not because they lack information, but because Texas is extremely good at creating a sense of safety. No income tax, a keep your money culture, an unspoken promise that if you work hard, the system won't turn its back on you as you age. Many people move to Texas believing that once they retire, the biggest burdens are behind them. They believe they've chosen the right place, that the final years of life won't be chased by costs beyond their control. And for many years, that feeling is real, until it isn't. The problem with Texas isn't that taxes appear suddenly. The problem is that taxes never stand still. Retirees here aren't hit with a single fatal blow. They're worn down, year by year, steadily, emotionlessly. And by the time they realize it, they're already very close to the danger line. Texas is known for an aggressively reassessed property valuation system. A home bought 20 years ago at a modest price can be reassessed at many times its original value, even if the owner hasn't made any meaningful upgrades. For someone still working, this can feel like paper wealth. For someone already retired, it becomes the source of an endless chain of anxiety. Many retirees in Texas say the same thing. I'm not poor, but I no longer control my bills. They don't borrow more. They don't expand their homes. They don't take risky investments. Yet every year, they have to recalculate whether they can still afford to stay. And that feeling breaks something very fundamental: peace of mind. Texas recognized this earlier than many other states, and it hasn't hidden the reality that, without adjustments, retirees would leave. But Texas's approach is completely different from Florida's. Texas doesn't try to erase the pressure. Texas tries to freeze it. This is exactly where the biggest misunderstanding comes from. Many people hear that Texas has solved the property tax problem for seniors, and they stop there. But the reality is far more complex. Texas doesn't remove the burden in an emotional way. Texas designs its system to prevent that burden from continuing to inflate over time. That's the key difference. For those who understand the rules correctly and act at the right moment when they become eligible, a home in Texas can become a genuinely stable place. Not because the costs disappear, but because they no longer spiral out of control. For those who misunderstand the system or miss the critical timing, Texas becomes a psychological trap. They believe they're safe, while the system continues to operate on its old momentum. The most dangerous thing in Texas is the feeling of, it's already taken care of. Many retirees fail to file at the right time. They don't review their property status. They don't fully understand the line between a primary residence and other types of assets. And when those mistakes accumulate long enough, the consequences are no longer minor. Texas doesn't punish seniors with a sudden blow. Texas punishes delay. And for people living on fixed income, time is the most expensive luxury of all. However, when handled correctly, Texas remains one of the rare places where retirees can see a relatively stable future. not because costs are low, but because they're predictable. For those who've spent a lifetime in financial uncertainty, predictability can matter more than how much money is saved. But Texas also sends a cold message. The system does not protect you automatically. It only protects those who understand it. And in today's America, that is a very hard truth to swallow. If Florida scares people with explosive pressure, Texas scares them with a false sense of safety. And the next state goes even further, a place where retirees aren't pushed out by costs, but by the disappearance of the community around them. 3. Tennessee. Quiet, but very clear. Tennessee doesn't talk much. It doesn't promote loudly. It doesn't hang slogans promising a retirement paradise. It simply looks at one very cold reality. When income no longer grows, housing costs cannot be allowed to become a suspended sentence hanging over seniors' heads. For many years, Tennessee has watched what's happening in other states. They've seen retirees leave their homes not because they're poor, but because they can no longer predict the future. They've seen places try to reassure people with words, while the system behind the scenes continues to run on old momentum. And they understand that what retirees need most isn't a big incentive, it's certainty. Many retirees in Tennessee say the same thing. They don't stay because everything is cheap. They stay because they can calculate their lives 10 to 15 years ahead. No more feeling like each year is a gamble. No more living in a constant state of waiting to see what next year will bring. For people who've lived long enough, uncertainty is the most frightening thing of all. What makes Tennessee different lies in how it makes decisions. When discussions take place in the state legislature, the tone isn't emotional. A senior lawmaker once stated plainly during a hearing, "We cannot ask people who have stopped working to keep racing against numbers they do not control." That statement didn't create media waves, but it accurately reflects Tennessee's way of thinking. The governor doesn't say much either. In a brief statement, he simply emphasized that Tennessee cannot build its future by pushing out the people who spent their entire lives contributing to their communities. No flowery language, no slogans, just one very clear message. The system must adapt to the aging of people, not the other way around. Unlike states that try to patch problems piece by piece, Tennessee approaches the issue like an administrator. They look at the entire budget. They calculate offsets. They clearly define who needs protection and how that protection should work. And most importantly, they understand that if laws change every election cycle, retirees will never dare to trust the system. That's why Tennessee focuses on creating a long-term, stable framework, not a short-term, politically motivated cut. This is what many outsiders misunderstand. They don't see shocking announcements. They don't see sensational headlines. But those living within the system feel the difference very clearly in their daily lives. Retirees in Tennessee don't say they're being given something for free. They say they can breathe. Breathe because their home is no longer the biggest variable in the equation of old age. Breathe because major decisions no longer have to be made in a state of panic. And for many people, that is worth more than any promise. Of course, Tennessee isn't a perfect paradise. It also faces budget pressure. It also has to make up revenue in other ways. But the difference lies in honesty. No one in Tennessee pretends that everything is free. They simply say that if society wants retirees to stay, then society must accept adjusting how it collects money. What's notable is that Tennessee does not view retirees as a burden. In policy documents, they are described as a stabilizing pillar. People who don't demand new schools, who don't strain the labor market, yet who sustain the vitality of local communities. When seen this way, Tennessee's decisions become very logical. And it's that logic that makes many other states uneasy. Because Tennessee has proven something dangerous. You don't need noise to change the landscape. You just need to clearly understand who you're protecting. If Florida sparks debate and Texas creates misunderstanding, then Tennessee leaves no room for emotional rebuttal. Everything here is too clear, too calculated, and too deliberate to be dismissed as accidental. If you've ever opened a tax bill with a sense of unease, like this video so you know you're not the only one. And subscribe to the channel so when important policy changes happen, you don't have to learn about them through a bill. But there's still one place that goes even further. A place that doesn't talk about stability or predictability, but about survival. A place where retirees don't just fear losing their homes. They fear the town they live in disappearing. 2. Wyoming. Keep people here, or the towns disappear. Wyoming is one of the rare places in America where you can clearly feel how fragile a community really is. Not fragile because of poverty, but fragile because there are simply too few people. Here, if a few hundred residents leave, an entire town can stop functioning. Schools close. Hospitals scale back. Stores disappear. And when that happens, there is no new wave coming in to replace them. Retirees in Wyoming understand this very well. They don't live here for convenience, not for opportunity, not for investment value. They live here because this is where they've spent their lives, where they know every road, every winter, every familiar face. And that's exactly why, when housing costs begin to feel heavy, their fear isn't just losing a home. Their fear is losing the place they belong to. Wyoming hasn't faced explosive price surges like Florida or Texas, but it faces something more dangerous: slow depletion. Young people leave to find work. Older residents stay until they can no longer carry the costs. And when seniors are forced to leave as well, there's no one left to keep the town alive. It's in this context that Wyoming lawmakers are forced to confront a brutally honest question. If the system continues operating the way it always has, will anyone still be living here in 10 to 15 years? This isn't a political question. It's a question of survival. Wyoming doesn't have a surplus budget. It doesn't have a large population to spread the burden. But it has one thing many other states don't: honesty. It doesn't pretend that retirees need incentives to be happy. It understands that retirees only need one thing: not to be pushed out. Not to be forced to sell their homes just to sustain a system that no longer fits demographic reality. A comment from an elderly resident at a community meeting in Wyoming spread quickly, not because of anger, but because of the exhaustion in it. He said, "I don't need more money. I just need to be left alone." The room fell silent. No one argued, because everyone understood this wasn't a demand. It was the final plea of someone who has lived long enough to no longer want to fight the system. Wyoming listens to statements like that, and it acts in a way that's very characteristic of the state. No promotion, no grand promises, no painted retirement paradise. It simply removes the parts of the system that make life unbearable for people who no longer have the ability to increase their income. In Wyoming, people don't talk much about benefits. They talk about keeping stores open, keeping schools with students, keeping fire stations staffed. And to make that possible, they understand that retirees must be able to remain in their homes without living under constant fear. What's striking is that Wyoming doesn't do this out of kindness. It does it because if it doesn't, it will disappear from the map in the most literal sense. This is a state that understands very clearly that when population falls below a certain threshold, everything collapses in a chain reaction. And retirees are the last barrier preventing that from happening. To outsiders, Wyoming may look like a harsh place, cold, sparse, lacking amenities. But for those who live there, being allowed to stay is already a luxury. Not a financial luxury, but a luxury of stability. Wyoming doesn't try to build paradise. It simply tries to keep itself from becoming a ghost town. And in today's America, that choice is both sad and extremely practical. But there is still one more state where decisions don't come from silence, nor from the fear of disappearance, but from a very cold calculation. If nothing changes, the entire system will collapse from within. 1. North Dakota. When survival forces policy to change direction, North Dakota isn't famous. It isn't densely populated. It doesn't attract massive waves of migration. But precisely because of that, it sees what many other places ignore. In North Dakota, when retirees leave, it's not just a budget issue. It's the story of a town disappearing. Here, population doesn't decline in cycles. It declines by age layers. Young people leave first to find work. Middle-aged residents follow. And retirees are the final layer still keeping communities alive. When this last group is also forced to sell their homes and leave, everything collapses very quickly. Schools close because there are no students. Hospitals shrink because there aren't enough patients to operate. Local businesses disappear because there are no customers. No economic crisis is required, just the absence of people. North Dakota looked straight at that scenario. They didn't use emotional language. They used data, and the data showed something frightening. If retirees aren't kept in place, many counties will no longer have enough population to sustain basic services within a single generation. This isn't a distant forecast. It's a curve that has already begun. That's why housing policy for retirees in North Dakota doesn't come from a desire to help. It comes from survival instinct. The state understands that if it continues treating retirees' homes as a revenue source that can be tightened over time, it is effectively pulling the pin on its own grenade. What sets North Dakota apart is how it frames the issue. Here, people don't talk about incentives. They talk about the right to stay, the right to continue living in the home you've been tied to for a lifetime, without being pushed out simply because time has passed. When a state speaks in terms of the right to stay rather than cost relief, it's a sign it's standing at the edge. What surprises many is that this policy hasn't faced the kind of backlash people expected. Because in North Dakota, everyone can see the consequences of not changing. Young people understand that if older residents leave, there will be no place to come back to. Local governments understand that without communities, there is no system left to manage. And retirees understand that this isn't a gift. It's a final agreement between them and the place they call home. North Dakota doesn't promise an easy life. Winters are still harsh. Opportunities are still limited. But it makes one thing very clear. If you are here, if you've put down roots, the system will not actively push you out. In an America that increasingly treats housing as a financial instrument, that is an extremely unusual choice, and a very thought-provoking one. Because when a state that isn't famous, isn't wealthy, and isn't populous is forced to change the rules simply to keep people from leaving, the real question is no longer what North Dakota is doing, but how many other states will eventually be forced to reach the same point. If you're living in a place where retirees are starting to leave faster than they stay, take a close look. North Dakota may not be the exception. It may simply be seeing the future sooner than the rest. There's one thing that needs to be said plainly. There is no perfect place. There is no system that makes everyone happy. But in these 5 states, something important has happened. The home is no longer used as a tool to force retirees out. And in this era, that is not a privilege. It is the final boundary of decency. If you are retired, don't just ask, "Where is it cheap?" Ask this instead. Will you be allowed to grow old in your own home? Which state are you living in? Do you feel your home is becoming safer or more fragile? If the analysis in this video helped you see your situation more clearly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future content about housing, taxes, and aging in America.